Good evening and welcome to this year's Raising Peace Conference. I'm Keith Suter and I've been asked to chair this evening's proceedings. It's a pleasure for me to be able to introduce such a diverse range of speakers. We will start off with an acknowledgement of country to be given by Aunty Rhonda Dixon-Grovenor, who is an elder and a First Nations traditional descendant. She is an academic, an activist and a filmmaker. So Aunty Rhonda, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter, much appreciated. Warami, Gadigal, Nora, Walamapemi, Inyana, Bayalawa, Ngayanayalang, Wudri, Darabariyanu. Welcome to country, wherever you are. My name's Aunty Rhonda Dixon-Grovenor, and I'm a Gadigal, Bejigal, Darug, and Yuin elder. And I'm a First Nations descendant of the Sydney area, Warleigh, of La Perouse area, also the area around Penrith, and the area of the Yuin Nation, far south coast, which goes over into Victoria and up into the Snowy Mountains. So I'm just going to read, I've written some words I feel to express what does peace mean to me as a First Nations elder. Peace for First Nations people means recognition, equality and respect. Peace is about well-being. Well-being for First Nations people is about culture, connection and access to Mother Earth, the waterways and the bush. It's about learning and doing our art and our ceremonies. It's about our cultural and family obligations. It's about being valued, acknowledged and included in all aspects of Indigenous programs. And it's about First Nations people developing and leading ideas and programs involving Indigenous language, stories, art, etc. Peace for First Nations people is about having our stories told by Indigenous people, stories of history, of knowledge, of connection to country, fire stick burning, the seasons, constellations, etc. Mother Earth needs us and we need Mother Earth. The world is in turmoil with COVID, fracking and poisoning of the land and waterways. Also with the floods and the wars and the climate turmoils. We as First Nations people need to lead the way back to the healing of the land and the water and each other and back to the peace. Yanu, my brothers and sisters.
Thank you very much indeed, Aunty Rhonda, for those inspiring words, a wonderful way in which we can start our conference. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure now to invite Rita Warley to speak. Rita is the founder of International Volunteers for Peace in Australia and is one of the initiators of the Raising Peace Festival. So we hand over to you now, Rita, please.
Thank you, Keith. And thank you, Rhonda, for that wonderful welcome. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners and pay my respects to the elders, past, present and emerging. This festival was originally intended to take place in 2020, inspired by the 100 years of international voluntary service for peace, initiated by Swiss pacifist Pierre Cérisol. He believed that people from different backgrounds working side by side on community projects for the benefit of humanity would forge friendships and international understanding that would make waging war impossible. The Australian branch of this movement, International Volunteers for Peace, will present a short film on Saturday the 25th, where you can learn more about how this works. Raising Peace could not have gone ahead without the collaboration of Margot Pearson of the New South Wales branch of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, who also celebrated their centenary in 2020, which is pretty amazing. And Nick Dean from the relatively new organisation, Independent and Peaceful Australian Network. It has grown from a planned exhibition and fair in the heart of Sydney, centred around the United Nations International Day of Peace, to an online event including over 30 organisations and 37 free events. The name Raising Peace was chosen because we believe it is time to celebrate peace, to bring it back into the public discourse, to profile the achievements and the ongoing efforts of those working for peace, to recognise peace as a process that needs our vigilance, and to change the focus of dialogue when it comes to our relationships with other nations, our environment, and our community. We see our government spending vast amounts of money on the celebration of war, on war memorials, on military and armaments, on engagement in wars, and just today, we heard the announcement about acquiring nuclear-powered submarines. We hear threatening words against other nations, fueling conflict rather than making peace. We condemn bullying in the kindergarten, so why do we tolerate it in our politicians? The keynote address of Raising Peace will be given by His Excellency, Mr. Armando Vargas Araya, Ambassador for Costa Rica, a country that sets an example to the world by their decision not to have a standing army. Tune in for that at 12 noon on Saturday, on the 21st of September. Our second aim was to foster collaboration among those working for peace, and we're totally thrilled and proud of the wonderful connection and collaboration happening in the preparation of this festival. There's been an openness and willingness, a learning and sharing, and from it we are gathering strength and commitment. And there is already talk of next year's Raising Peace Festival. Whoops. A third aim was to encourage young people to take up the cause of peace. It is fantastic that young people will be involved in many of the events throughout the festival, as well as organising a session on Youth for Peace at 3:30 on the 25th of September. And we could not have managed moving the whole festival online without our team of wonderful young people who put their hands up to take on the technical challenge. I'm sure you'll find many inspiring events on the program, whether your interest is in peace on the micro level, peace within, peace with our First Nations brothers and sisters, or peace in international relations. So what will be the outcomes of this festival? We hope that you'll be inspired to start a discourse about peace, to take up peace studies, to sing songs for peace, to wear a blue scarf, to volunteer for peace, to write to a politician or become a politician. Please join one of our 4 open sessions where you can discuss your thoughts and ideas and hopefully arm yourselves with tools to take the cause of peace forward. Peace needs you. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Rita. That's very good, a good explanation of why we're meeting in this way. And of course, one of the advantages of being able to meet during this crisis over COVID is that we now have a global audience. I've noticed that so far in all the over 100 people who've registered so far, we've got people from Malaysia, Nepal, and England. So this has become not just a Sydney event, but it's become a global event. So thank you, Rita, and the organising team for putting together such an inspiring program. Now, the next speaker is the Honourable David Shoebridge. Now, has David been able to join us? Is David online yet? I know he's got heavy parliamentary responsibilities. We have all sorts of difficulties in the state of New South Wales at the moment. So, yes. David, have you been able to arrive yet?
No, unfortunately, he's not with us yet, Keith.
All right, fine. Well, we then move to Rob Baker. Now, originally, Dr. Alison Bronowski was due to address us, but she's had a medical issue and is not well enough to be broadcasting this evening. And so she's asked one of her colleagues, Rob Baker, who will speak on behalf of the organisation Australians for War Powers Reform. So the few lines that I've got describing Rob Baker is that he joined the Australian for War Powers Reform because of his opposition to Australia's involvement in a number of wars of choice, involvement in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq. I was concerned about the lack of a democratic process and decisions made for the involvement in those wars. My career was in working with families affected by child abuse and community recovery from disasters and emergencies. Rob is now retired, and he joined the organisation Australians for War Power Reform 5 years ago, and he's been a member of the management committee for the last 4 years. And Rob, we're very grateful to you for standing in at the last moment. So we now hand over to you, please, Rob.
Thank you very much, Keith, and thank you, Aunty Rhonda, for your welcome. I'm speaking to you from Ngunnawal in the Ngambri country. It's a critical time to consider how decisions are made to involve Australian forces in armed conflict overseas. There's the fueling of conflict with China that Rita's talked about. There's the withdrawal of Australian troops from Afghanistan after 20 years of war. And there's the announcement today of a new deal for Australia to purchase nuclear-powered submarines from the US and the UK, with, I guess, a pretty clear message to China about, I guess, aggression, really. And there's an announcement of a new defence pact between Australia, the US and the UK, or I guess a rebadged defence pact called AUKUS, which also makes us wonder about where that takes our alliance with New Zealand and ANZUS. As you probably all know, Australia can be taken to war by one person alone. That's the Prime Minister. Now, under the Australian Constitution, the decision is actually made by the Governor-General, but in practice, it's usually made by the Prime Minister, who advises the Governor-General accordingly. Now, the Prime Minister can take advice behind closed doors with Cabinet. The Prime Minister of the day almost always consults with the US President and has done since the Korean War. Our elected representatives in Parliament don't really have any say in this decision, which is interesting when we consider that it's often said that we go to war to protect our democracy, but we don't have a democratic process in this decision making. Now, this process is an artefact of the past, of the royal prerogative to declare war, and that's because at the time of Federation and the writing of the Australian Constitution, we had no foreign policy that was independent of the UK. When Britain went to war in World War I and World War II, Australia and other dominions like Canada and New Zealand and India and so on were automatically at war. And this didn't change until Australia ratified the Statute of Westminster in 1942. So we could see that democracy and independence in Australia has been and continues to be an incremental process, and one which is still maturing. And I think we still have some way to go to achieve that amount, the degree of democracy that we purport to have, and the independence that we so cherish, and the sovereignty that we so cherish, because we don't really have sovereignty when it comes to declaring war. A little bit about Australians for War Powers Reform and our Be Sure on War, No War Without Parliament campaign. Australians for War Powers Reform grew out of a campaign for an inquiry into the Iraq War in 2012. By 2015, the focus had changed to reforming the war powers as exercised in Australia, the process by which decisions are made to go to war. Australians for War Powers Reform was established by a group of former senior public servants, former diplomats, academics, lawyers and medical professionals. Now, we're not aligned with any political party, though we do support any parties that urge for reform. Our recommendation for reform would still allow the executive to act swiftly, because a lot of people are concerned about, well, what would happen if Australia was attacked? Another kind of bombing of Darwin situation. We're not recommending that a debate should be had when Australia was directly threatened by aggression, where our existential survival was under threat. But in my lifetime, and I'm not a young man, the wars that we've been to have not been wars where we've been protecting ourselves from existential threat. They've been what you might consider to be wars of choice. So we would recommend under those circumstances that there should always be a debate and there should always be a vote. And there is certainly time in those circumstances to do that. There's no there's no urgency related to those those kinds of wars that we've been involved in. There have been several attempts made to reform war powers in Australia since 1985. The first were by the Australian Democrats, and later the Greens have made a number of attempts to reform war powers. And currently, as you know, Senator Jordan Steele-John has a bill before Parliament to amend the Defence Act. The ALP has passed a resolution at their national conference that there should be an inquiry into the process by which decisions are made to join conflict. The polls that have been conducted in Australia have indicated that the Australian public is behind reform. A Roy Morgan poll that Australians for War Powers Reform conducted in 2020 indicated that 83% of Australians think that decisions to involve Australian forces in armed conflict should be subject to parliamentary approval always, or unless there is immediate danger to Australia. This year, in 2021, a poll by Digital Edge Survey, which was commissioned by Mike Smith, recently found that this number had risen to 87% of Australians who feel that reform should happen. I don't know, many of you might have been following Michael West media. Michael West journalists have been conducting a poll amongst parliamentarians about their views about war powers reform. One by one, they've been soliciting responses from members of parliament and senators about their thoughts about the decision-making progress with regard to our participation in armed conflict and whether the status quo is satisfactory or not. Now, while it's encouraging to see that many support an inquiry and a few support a debate before a decision to go to war is made by Parliament, it's clear that our parliamentaries are largely out of step with the public expectations that have been indicated by these polls. Now, it's interesting that some of the parliamentarians who are, I guess, wary about reform mention the possibility of unintended consequences if we change the way that we make decisions to go to war. And I might say that we would be changing the way that we make decisions to go to war in line with a more democratic process that exists in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and a number of other democracies around the world, and several European countries that are similar to our own in values and the way that we kind of conduct our democracy generally. So we wouldn't be outliers in this regard. In fact, in many ways, we're outliers now. So when we look at the possible unintended consequences of changing our legislation with regard to war powers, you're really led to think about the unintended consequences that we've experienced and that the world's experienced. Over the last 20 years of conflict, there were no weapons of mass destruction found in Iraq. That was an unintended consequence. A bit of a whoops moment, really, but none of the leaders who led us to those wars have expressed any regret for doing so. There's been hundreds of thousands of deaths. There's been millions of people displaced. The Middle East has sunk into instability. A number of failed states. There's been a destruction of infrastructure and the environment. There's been an estimated threefold growth in the number of fundamentalist Islamic fighters of various stripes, whether they be Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, or ISK. And that's not to mention the deaths of our own servicemen and women, the PTSD that's been experienced by many of them, and the contribution that these wars have made to veteran suicides. What we would like to happen in a discussion and a debate in Parliament before we go to war is an exploration of and a delineation of what is the exact purpose and the objectives of this deployment. Something that was missing really in the deployments, certainly in Iraq, after weapons of mass destruction weren't found. There were all kinds of reasons that were given for why we were there, but really they were not really clear or purposeful. Is the war legal? We often speak about our adherence to a rules-based order. I mean, even today, the French government questioned that in regard to our broken contract with them about the submarines that we were going to get. Is it consistent with domestic law? Is it consistent with international law? What are the likely human costs? What are the economic costs? What are the environmental costs? What would success look like? How would we know? I mean, these wars have dragged on. Osama bin Laden was killed 10 years ago, and yet the war in Afghanistan continued. What are the alternatives to military action? And are we putting enough resources into diplomacy, into foreign aid, because to avoid the pointy end of diplomacy, which is war? And do we have the resources to achieve the objectives that we're aiming to achieve? When we think about getting involved in a war in Afghanistan and then the hubris of involving ourselves in wars on two fronts and going to Iraq, which was absolutely disastrous. So what do we do with all of this? Well, I'd encourage you to check out the Be Sure on War website and the Australians for War Powers Reform website, and our social media campaigns. I'd encourage you to follow Michael West's survey of parliamentarians, and most of all, I'd encourage you to contact your local member of parliament. They will toe the party line to a large degree, but they are there to represent you, and not just your local MP, but the senators in your states as well. Write to them and let them know how you feel. Thank you very much.
Lovely. Thanks very much indeed, Rob. That's very interesting indeed, with plenty of practical information. And we repeat again that Dr. Alison Bronowski, who is due to be speaking this evening, is unwell, and Rob has agreed at the very last minute to stand in for her and gave that very informative presentation. So thank you again, Rob, for your presentation and your ability to do it with such a limited amount of time. I remind people that this is being recorded, so it'll be available for viewing again later. It's also interesting to look in the chat to see who else is joining us. We know the numbers continue to go up, and overall we've got several hundreds who are registered for the entire series of events over the next few days. But we have at the moment joining us people from India, New Zealand, Eritrea, Indonesia and Tanzania. So we've got many of the world's continents well represented this evening. Now, may I ask again, Danielle, has the Honourable David Shoebridge been able to get out of his parliamentary sitting to join us?
He has, Keith. Yes, he's with us now.
Lovely. Well, it's my pleasure now to invite the Honourable David Cubridge MLC to join us. He's been a member of the upper house representing the Greens Party for well over a decade. And he's been the Greens Party spokesperson on local government, justice and multiple other portfolios, and has been very sympathetic to the holding of this event. So the Honourable David Shoebridge, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Oh, thanks very much, Keith, and thanks everybody for the invitation to come and speak to this event. I'm so sorry I was late. It wasn't parliamentary duties. The New South Wales government is not really keen on Parliament at the moment. They're trying not to have it meet. I was at a lengthy consent workshop with Chanel Contos and others, which was a valuable event. But I would like to commence by acknowledging that I'm here on the lands of the Gadigal people and pay my respects to those elders past, present and emerging. And indeed, when you're talking about peace, we're talking about the need for fostering concepts of peace. I think we should acknowledge that that is grounded in Australia by reaching out and having a just settlement with First Nations peoples, which involves land treaty and self-determination. It's with today's events and the announcement of Australia deciding to, entrench traditional alliances in the region, to acquire nuclear-powered submarines, could there be a more important time to talk about a different agenda, one that isn't based upon weaponry and fear and the multi-billion-dollar international arms industry, but a conversation based around peace and non-violence. I'm a Greens MP, and one of the 4 pillars of my party is actually peace and non-violence. And I have to say, when you look at the discussion we've had in the last 24 hours, even less than that now, it has been fascinating to see a strong discussion about peace and non-violence and alternatives to the proposal put forward. But I suppose I wanted to speak to you about looking back over the last, multiple decades of Australia's foreign relations policy, and have a look at how the failure to put front and centre concepts of human rights, concepts of self-determination, concepts of peace and non-violence has done us a gross disservice. And not just us a gross disservice, it's done a gross disservice to the people in our region, and indeed to our potential neighbours and allies. The Australian government tends to want to hunt out its new exciting big friend. It has a history of doing that over time. The initial, great, our great ally and friend, the United Kingdom, when it became apparent that wasn't going to suit our purposes in World War II, we lurched over to the United States as our new powerful friend. And then over the last few decades, we've seen a very awkward relationship develop with China. And I suppose when you look at the foreign affairs, the foreign affairs, the way in which Australia has engaged in foreign affairs, it's been focusing on concepts of military might, trade and trade relationships. They have been the primary focus of our foreign affairs. Who is the ally that we can join with the largest degree of military might? And how can we engage in international relations in a way that will maximise our trade returns? And in doing that, concepts such as human rights have played a very much the second fiddle, if they have been raised at all. So we could look at, for example, the relationship with Indonesia and the way in which, in the mid-1970s, Australia was very comfortable, indeed encouraging of Indonesia traducing the rights of East Timor and invading East Timor. Australia at the time took what's called a realpolitik kind of approach to this. Well, Indonesia is big, East Timor is small. Why should we have a human rights-based response to this? We should go with where the power is, confirm a relationship with the Suharto government, and really put human rights second in that relationship with Indonesia. Well, that turned out to be a dreadful strategic mistake, because the Indonesia's role in East Timor became a running sore in the relationship between the Australian people and Indonesia. It became a running international sore for Indonesia and became a very destabilising element with Indonesia. And you can see how the failure to advocate for a human rights-based agenda in that instance, far from allowing us to have a stronger and deeper relationship with Indonesia, actually placed at the centre of the relationship between Australia and Indonesia an ongoing a source of discord and a destabilising element within Indonesia and within the relationship between Australia and Indonesia. We have, since the independence of East Timor, we've had a much a rebalancing of the relationship with Indonesia by the removal of that one distinct human rights confrontation with Indonesia, and our relationship is stronger and more stable. I won't speak about West Papua because we have a similar issue there with West Papua as well. That the failure in the 60s to confront that from a human rights agenda has now seen a 5, 6, 7 decade long conflict in West Papua, and again is a potentially destabilising element in the relationship with Indonesia. The refusal from Australian foreign affairs policy to put human rights and a human rights-based agenda at the front of our international relationships destabilises those relationships. You can see with when you cast your eye over the relationship with China since the economic opening up of China, you see again the Australian foreign affairs establishment willing to not confront the human rights abuses from the Chinese government, not place that as a central part of the relationship between the Australian government and the Chinese government. And by ignoring it and by ignoring those quite distinct differences that we have on a human rights on the human rights approach and prioritising only trade, that ultimately did not provide a basis and will not provide a basis for a long and stable relationship with China. Simply trying to pretend that the human rights issues are entirely separate from our foreign affairs relationships and our trade relationships with China has not proved to be a basis for a stable, growing, respectful relationship. And we are seeing that relationship spiralling downwards. And one of the reasons I would suggest we have seen that is because we thought we could have a relationship based entirely on economic self-interest and trade, and not engage from the outset of that relationship a deeper discussion about human rights and about mutual respect and the international order. And it seems to be it's a repeating element in Australia's approach to foreign affairs. If we could roll to the last 5 to 10 years, as we've seen Australia's relationship with China becoming far more problematic, we've seen Australia then reach out to try and strengthen relationships with other countries in the region, but most notably India. And in reaching out to India, it's a fairly transparent approach by Australia to see that that is a way of having a potential, an element of a potential counterbalance to China. But in the relationship with India, again, we are not seeing Australia prioritise the human rights dialogue as a core part of the relationship with India. Of course, we should have a deep and respectful relationship with India. There are many cultural affinities that we have with the people of India. Hopefully, an ongoing respect for democracy. But we have seen the current administration in India really start degrading that country's democracy, degrading the independence of the judiciary, engaging in fairly systemic human rights abuses in Kashmir, encouraging some appalling laws on citizenship, which are marginalising the rights of elements of the Indian population. And what has Australia's response to that been? Well, Australia has not confronted a single element of that. There's not a single statement you'll see from the Australian government pointing out those problematic trends being driven by the Indian government at the moment, because we are again on another journey of saying, well, it's all about power and trade, it's about military alliances and trade, and we can just put all those human rights issues to the side because we've got this realpolitik approach. I don't believe that is a basis for an ongoing, deep and stable relationship, because without the human rights abuses being confronted and being part of the dialogue between Australia and India, the relationship is extremely fragile, and it in many ways is a repetition of that history that Australia has had of focusing on military and trade and ignoring just how important the dialogue on human rights, the cultural exchange on human rights is to those deep and stable relationships that we really do need in our region. There is more I could say on this, but I know that time is short. But I'm very grateful for the organisers for having this discussion. I couldn't have imagined it happening on a more important day or a more important time. But as a Greens MP, coming to the approach of foreign affairs, coming to the approach of international relationships from these concepts of both peace and non-violence and an ultimate respect for human rights, I would just urge policymakers to realise how basing a relationship on that creates a stability and a strength to relationships that will ultimately be not in just Australia's trade and economic and military interests, but in the global interests as well.
Good. Thank you very much indeed. The Honourable David Shoebridge, who's obviously very busy given some of the parliamentary issues in New South Wales today. David is a member of the upper house of the New South Wales State Parliament. And so we're grateful, David, for your participation. It's interesting, having noted the number of countries that are being represented here, also the diversity of the indigenous lands on which we are residing. I am, for example, on the land of the Cadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we're getting responses from people right the way across Australia, as well as right the way across the globe. Could I also say that after our next speaker, we will be able to open up and have some questions to the speakers. So you might be giving some thought to that, and you can ask your questions in the chat facility, which is at the bottom of your screen. It's my pleasure now to introduce David Brophy for his involvement, particularly about Australia-China relations. David Brophy is an historian of China at the University of Sydney, a frequent commentator on Australia-China relations, and the author of China Panic, Australia's Alternative to Paranoia and Pandering, published by Black Ink. In his academic work, he specializes in the history of Xinjiang and the Uyghurs, that's the western part of China. His first book was a history of Uyghur nationalism. It's called Uyghur Nation, Reform and Revolution on the Russia-China Frontier, and that was published by Harvard. He's also an active member of the National Tertiary Education Union. So I invite David Brophy now to join us. The floor is yours, David. Thank you.
Thank you. There we go. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you, Keith, and greetings, everyone. Thank you also to Aunty Rhonda. I'm also on Gadigal land this evening at Sydney University. And look, I want to congratulate the organisers of this festival for getting it off the ground. There is, of course, never a bad time to build pro-peace and anti-war sentiment, but the last few weeks in particular have shown the urgency to that task here in Australia. It's shown that in a couple of ways that I want to talk about. I'll say a few words first about the fallout from Afghanistan. And what I see is a very conspicuous effort to avoid Australia drawing any lessons from that conflict. Even the idea that the decision to go to war there was contested has been almost entirely obscured from the discussion. Instead, we've consistently heard from the architects of the war. The ABC has interviewed Paul Wolfowitz, John Howard, and the same pundits who provided ideological justifications for the war from its beginning. That American airstrikes could avoid civilian casualties, that there was a winning formula for the West in Afghanistan if we could just give it more troops and more time. We've flipped back, I feel, to a very simplistic pre-war depiction of Afghanistan as some sort of terrorist hellhole without asking an obvious question. If the Taliban are bad guys, true enough, how bad must the occupation regime have been? How despised among ordinary Afghans that the Taliban were able to revive and then waltz into Kabul when Western troops left. And we've seen a series of talking points that take as given the West's right to do what it did to Afghanistan and assume the likelihood that we might do the same again. For example, you might have heard this anxiety that if we don't get the people who worked with Australia out of Afghanistan, well, then people won't trust us in a similar situation in the future. And hearing this, I kept wanting to ask, where do people have in mind? Where are we planning to do this again? The point surely has to be that there must never be similar situations in the future. The time of Western governments intervening in poor defenseless countries to reshape their politics to our liking has to end. And the second point, obviously, that highlights the need to build and mobilize anti-war sentiment is, of course, the escalation of tensions with China. Now, we have to remember that the withdrawal from Afghanistan has been justified in part by the need to focus energy on China. And the fact that Biden has been willing to incur the considerable criticism for that withdrawal can be seen as an indication of the importance that the American government attributes to that focus. In my book, China Panic, which Keith mentioned, I describe what I see as a concerted campaign from 2017 onwards to pull Australia out of a hedging stance towards China and give it a leading role in catalyzing a US-led containment strategy towards China. Now, if you can think back to 2017, that period, that campaign initially centered on exaggerated warnings of domestic political interference, a depiction of China as undermining Australian democracy. And that, of course, dredged up all sorts of racist tropes of Chinese Australians as a fifth column for Beijing and so on. I hope you're familiar with this discourse. That discourse, of course, has taken on an increasingly militaristic tone of late. Think back a couple of months ago, these speeches by Peter Dutton, Mike Pizzullo, talking up the need for military preparedness, the drums of war, and of course today's flag-draped announcement of the purchase of nuclear-powered submarines. So confronting and reversing this slide towards confrontation in East Asia, in my opinion, has to be the priority for all anti-war activists and really anyone who has a hope for a better world in Australia today. And I do want to commend the Greens, David's party, for taking a very firm line today, responding clearly by stating that they intend to fight this decision to push Australia across the nuclear threshold and purchase these submarines. But we need an alternative framing of the whole situation, something different to the dominant one of an innocent Australia being bullied by China. Not to replace that with an equally simplistic image of an innocent China being bullied by the West, but to recognize the dynamics here of a geopolitical rivalry between the US and China, with America's desire to uphold a fragile hegemony in Asia being called into question by China's economic, political, and military rise in the region. Now, there's no threat in a conventional sense to Australia in this. There is, though, the possibility that a diminished US role in the region will diminish America's interest in its relationship to Australia, in its alliance with Australia. And that calls into question the basic principle of Australian foreign policy that other speakers have touched on ever since colonization, an alliance with an imperial hegemon in Asia. And not, I would insist, as a defensive measure, as it's often portrayed, but as a method of actively shaping Asian politics in accordance with elite Australian interests that are sold to us as the national interest. And the sustainability of that policy is now in question. That is what is provoking this hawkish lurch in Canberra. Australia has actively sought to stiffen American resolve and offer strategies and talking points for taking on China, as well as seeking ways to bind the two nations' militaries. That's what we see in the nuclear submarines. This is not something imposed on Australia, something that Australia has actively lobbied for. Now, there's the technical side to that as well, but the bigger picture is, of course, as one American official put it today, that this is, to quote, a fundamental decision that binds decisively Australia to the United States and Great Britain for generations. The risks here are obvious, putting Australia on the front lines of a Cold War that could go hot and potentially escalate to a nuclear level, all for a cause that no one should be willing to die for: the maintenance of post-World War II American dominance in Asia, and alongside that, Australia's own ability to dominate its region in a similar fashion in partnership with the US. It's not going to be easy to resist the pressure here. We know that there are, of course, deep reserves of racist hostility to Asia in Australia that cannon will be drawn on to sustain this campaign. So we need to link anti-war campaigning to anti-racist work. Of course, we need to point to the alternatives to endless increases in military spending in a time of austerity, and make the point that the high-minded justifications that will be advanced for conflict with China, human rights and so on, these cannot be advanced via the methods that our politicians are advocating. So we need to find allies, in particular among young Australians, I think, who've not really seen what a serious anti-war movement looks like. That's certainly the case among the students that I talked to. Polls show that young Australians in particular are on our side on this issue. We need to get to them before the war hawks do. What we certainly can't do is trust our politicians to see the light and pull out of this deadly game of chicken with China. Thanks, everyone. I wish the festival every success.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Thank you very much indeed, David. That was an excellent presentation and, of course, very topical given today's announcements that have been made. I remind people that we have an opportunity for people now to ask questions. We will be finishing on the dot of 7:30. So we've got a few minutes left over for questions, which is excellent. Let me just start the ball rolling by putting a question to all of the principal speakers relating to the need for us to change away from real politics, the realpolitik, this particular approach that Australia has followed. And what would be the way of doing it? The obvious way, of course, would be to put the Greens in power. So I better start with asking David to respond to that, and then I'll go to Rob and then David. How do we change the basic narrative of Australian foreign policy, which has haunted us for 200 years?
Well, I mean, that's a big question, Keith, but I think prioritising peace and peaceful relationships and looking and being overtly critical of just how the realpolitik agenda has failed Australia for the last, at least the last 50, 60 years. This focus on realpolitik means that some of the most critical elements in our relationships in the region just aren't on the table when we're having dealings, government to government dealings. And you know, I gave a couple of examples. I could have given more examples, but you look at East Timor, failing to see that as a core issue, a core human rights issue in the relationship, and instead focusing on a kind of realpolitik. In that case, you know, seeing a fairly right-wing authoritarian military dictatorship as a bulwark to communism and just sign on to their agenda regardless, has proven to be, proved itself to be very destructive of the long-term relationship with Indonesia. And I can see us repeating those mistakes at the moment in the deepening of military and trade ties with India without being honest and upfront about some of the very real and increasingly aggravated human rights issues that we see with the current BJP government in India. So, I mean, I think pointing out how realpolitik ultimately it pretends to be a kind of harsh, hard view about what's in our long-term interests. It's never proven to be that case. I mean, when we have engaged in the past, it's proven to be, in fact, a very partial view of the world, which leaves us with very fragile relationships, and also it's the neighbours. Our neighbours see us as a nation that's willing to sort of cut corners on our principles, and it doesn't produce an environment of trust coming back towards us either. So, you know, that's I suppose what I'd like to say at the moment. I agree with what David's saying as well about just how dangerous this moment is at the moment, with the sort of very clear rhetoric about war, about the inevitability of conflict, and actually speaking against the inevitability of conflict. I mean, what are our interests at stake here? Why are we spending billions of dollars arming ourselves? Whose interests are we really protecting? I would argue almost certainly the interests we're protecting are the interests of our great and powerful friends, which are often very much at odds with Australia's national interests as well.
Thanks, David. So, Rob, please.
Sorry, just unmuting. Yeah, I agree with David. I also think that it's interesting that that in Australia here, our Commonwealth government seems to only look in the long term when it comes to procuring weapons that won't be delivered until probably sometime in the next decade, probably towards the end of the next decade. But most of the other decisions are made just in relation to the election cycle. We don't seem to, our foreign policy doesn't seem to look in the long term. You know, when we support, the war in Afghanistan didn't just go on for 20 years. I mean, it's gone on for about 40 years. And the consequences of American foreign policy, which we slavishly follow, are being seen today. Now, I'm all for alliances. I'm happy that we have an ANZUS alliance, but I think that our obligations under the ANZUS alliance are overstated. And I think that what we can expect from America under the ANZUS alliance is also overstated. I support alliances and agreements with other countries. I'm concerned about the fact that we criticise China, and China certainly has things to criticise, but we also ally ourselves with other countries, as David's pointed out, that we could also be criticising. I would just like to see a more independent Australia.
David.
Do you want to take some more questions from the floor if the time?
All right, okay. Can I, before going on to the next question, I'll make the comment, we've got a note here that Afghanistan is a focus of the latest addition to our Raising Peace program, featuring an all-Afghan panel, including some who were evacuated, and the panel will envisage what a peaceful future for Afghanistan might look like. And it'll be moderated by Senator Maureen Farki, next Wednesday afternoon at 2:30. You can get more information from the Raising Peace website. Dr. Hannah Middleton of the Anti-Bases Campaign Coalition and IPAN have invited everyone to a Zoom meeting on this Saturday, the 18th of September at 3 p.m. And she gives, again, in the chat session, more information. So everyone is invited to that. Let's go back now to the questions. One that has come, and I'll give it to the other David to start off with, because he's our China specialist. What would the panel do if China did attack Australia or another nation in the region, such as Hong Kong or Taiwan? How do we manage that big question?
All right. Well, look, I don't want to spend too much time talking about China attacking Australia, because I don't think that's on the agenda. I do think the question, though, of conflict around Taiwan is one that we need to get our heads around, and it's a difficult one. And I think that it's often presented in slightly simplistic terms. People would like to assume that it's easy enough to just say, well, this is an internal Chinese affair. None of our business, let them resolve the issue for themselves. Now, Taiwan is horribly complicated because the official position of both governments is, in fact, that yes, these are both part of China. But you have a large Taiwanese population that never really had any say in their incorporation by the Republicans in the 1940s. And majority sentiment in Taiwan now is not to pursue any kind of unification with the mainland. We know that China sees this as an objective. So there is potential for conflict here. When we think about intervening, though, I think we need to remember what Clausewitz said, the Prussian military theorist, that war is the continuation of politics by other means. Should a country like the United States choose to intervene militarily in a conflict between China and Taiwan, it will not be for democracy in Taiwan. It will not be for the sake of the people of Taiwan. It will be because America has calculated that this is an opportune moment to try to use the military instrument to advance its objectives in its wider conflict with China. Because any kind of conflict around Taiwan cannot be contained to the Taiwan Straits. Any military response to that would have to involve attacks on the Chinese mainland, involving all the escalatory risks that entails. So my position is that we should be advocating a position of self-determination for people of Taiwan. That should be politically our position, and we need to advance that principle more generally, internationally. That means advancing it consistently, including in places like Kashmir, including in places like West Papua. But that Australia should not contemplate ever intervening militarily in any war with China. So the challenge for us really is to formulate a strategy that can prevent that from occurring, which is why I think it's really important that we start identifying the principles at stake in our relationship with China, and embedding them in a serious way in our foreign policy, rather than just being selective when we choose to raise the banner of human rights and democracy, and where we turn a blind eye to those things, as David has pointed out.
Thanks, David. There is another question on human rights, a more of a meta question, I think. Given our abysmal record on protecting human rights, how can Australia be taken seriously as an agent of peace overseas? A question, I think, first of all, to the Honourable David Shoebridge. Given our appalling record, why on earth would anybody take us seriously when we start talking about being an agent of peace?
Oh, Keith, you don't need to do the honourable going forward. Just David is fine. I've got to say obviously there are major failings in Australia's human rights record. And you'd start with the appalling historical and current treatment of First Nations peoples in Australia. You'd look at our relationships in the South Pacific, and you can't in any way pretend that Australia goes forward as some sort of blemish-free paragon of human rights. But no country has a perfect human rights record, and those failings of our own human rights record shouldn't prevent us from at least having the goal and the principle of respecting human rights in our relationships with other countries, and expecting better from us and expecting better from others. But I think being honest about Australia's, quite appalling human rights record, especially with First Nations peoples, would be a bloody good starting point for those international relationships as well. We would have a stronger negotiating point to talk about the need for other countries to respect human rights if we did that as well. And again, it goes back to my view that what happens internally and domestically within countries is extremely relevant for their relationships on an international level. If we as a government are disrespecting the human rights of First Nations peoples, I would expect us to be harshly judged by other nations when we're seeking to open up an exchange with them. And so I do think honesty, reflection, and fundamental reform domestically is part of the agenda. But I go back to the point: no country has a blemish-free human rights record, and it shouldn't prevent us from having a human rights-based set of values in our international relations.
Thank you, David. Well, we're coming almost to the end of our session. I'd like to thank on your behalf the three principal speakers this evening, David Brophy, Rob Baker, and David Shoebridge. Again, apologies that Dr. Alison Bronowski at the last minute had a medical issue and was unable to join us. So I'd like to thank, on behalf of all the participants here and those who will watch this movie later on, thank you to our three principal speakers for your presentation. I now turn to Diane Tippett, who's also on the organising committee, who's going to give us the final comments and invite us to join in other events. So over to you, please, Diane, to close the conference.
Thank you, Keith. I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for attending our first event tonight. This is the first event of 37 over the next 10 days, all of which are free to register for. Whatever your definition of peace, we really hope that we can cover it with our broad spectrum approach, which include events covering a First Nations perspective on peace, the role of women in the peace movement, prospects for peace in Afghanistan, and more. All tickets can be booked through our Eventbrite page, and like tonight, you will receive the Zoom link an hour before the session begins. Having said that, this concludes our session tonight. Thank you again, and we hope to see you in future sessions.